Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavai Tejasvinavadidanastu ma vidvishavai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us, may he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Om Peace, Peace, Peace. And good evening. We are reading from the complete works of Swami Abhedananda, and we're reading the lecture on the realization of the self. We should finish that tonight, and we might go into the next lecture, Immortality of the Self. But let's continue with this lecture. And if you're following along, it's on page 135.
The nature of the self is all-knowing. Its knowledge does not depend upon the relation between the knower and the object of knowledge, but it remains unchanged even when all the objects of knowledge have ceased to exist. The all-knowing self may be compared to the self-effulgent sun, as the nature of the sun is to illumine itself as well as other objects. So the light of the self illumines its own nature, as also the phenomenal world. The sun itself can illumine everything as well as its own form. We do not need a candle or a torch to see it. Therefore, we call it self-effulgent. Self-effulgent does not need any other light to illumine its nature. For the same reason, the Atman is said to be the self-effulgent sun of knowledge. That knowledge by which one perceives all sensations and feelings, organic functions, intellection, understanding, and other activities of the mind, as well as external objects. The sun, moon, stars is the light of the self-effulgent Atman, or self, which is the source of intelligence and consciousness.
Yeah, so of course the basic idea is that the self is one with Brahman, and Brahman is the absolute existence, consciousness, and bliss. It's the source of everything. By its power do we see and do we hear and feel and taste and touch? Do we think and have feelings? Everything is from the power of the Atman. I was going to try to play something from the oratorio on the Chandi to illustrate how in the Chandi the same concepts are talked about, but they're all talked about in mythological terms, using the Divine Mother as the symbol for the be-all and end-all. She is the all in all. She is the source of everything. And so it's simply a different way of getting across the same idea. She interpenetrates everything. She is the source of all the devas, all the gods, all the goddesses, and all the demons. She's the source of everything. She's the source of the ignorant. She's the source of the liberation. So it's for the sake of the devotees, we are able to, and Brahman personifies itself through its power as all of these divine forms. Now next week we'll be celebrating Shivaratri, and you can do the same thing with the idea of Shiva. Shiva is the embodiment of everything. And it's through, Shiva is the underlying principle through which everything is functioning. So let's continue with the next paragraph here.
This self-effulgent Atman is the knower and director of the mind and senses. The mind and senses will not perform any function if they are separated from the self-effulgent light of knowledge. Mind, as we have already seen, is finer matter in vibration. Vedanta does not teach that mind is the same as the self or spirit. There's no intelligence in the vibration of the mind substance. It is not the source of consciousness. All the activities of the mind may stop. Still, we shall remain conscious of ourself. In the state of samadhi, there may not be any feeling like fear, anger, or any other modification of the mind substance, such as volition, desire, emotion, will, determination, cognition, or understanding. But one does not lose self-consciousness or become absolutely unconscious in that state. This will prove that pure consciousness or pure intelligence is separate from and independent of mental functions.
And of course, our mental functions are independent of the brain too, and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence to indicate that. People have out of the body experiences. People have near-death experiences. People have spiritual experiences, and all of these experiences point to the fact that the mind is working through the brain, but it can also work independent of it. It doesn't have to work through the physical brain. There are cases of dementia patients where the brain is quite deteriorated towards just at the end of life, when the soul is about to leave the body. They suddenly become much more lucid and clear and are able to express themselves in ways that they simply couldn't have just a few moments before, indicating that there's something different about the true intellect, the true cosmic mind that we are connected to, that pure intelligence. All right, let's, I was going to mention about vibrations too. We've talked about this before, but let's just review this again, because some of you may not have heard all the classes, but it talks about how the mind is finer in vibration. And we can use the idea of octaves in a musical scale to get that idea across. The lower octaves could be thought of as perhaps more gross or fundamental. They're slower and deeper and more resonant. And then the finer and finer you go, they become finer and higher vibrations, and eventually they become so high that we can't even hear them. So similarly, we are aware of this gross plane, and we know we have thoughts, but we don't see them moving around, although we know that some people can read other people's thoughts, so they have to be going from your mind to somebody else's mind in some sense. And then, of course, you have emotions, which are probably an in-between kind of vibration, probably a little lower than our thought vibration, but higher than our physical vibration. And then there's the spiritual vibrations. And so we are a mass of different kinds of vibrations for different kinds of vibrational bodies. And this is where you get concepts of vibrational healing, where people might use light therapy or sound therapy, or even homeopathic remedies work on this principle, that there's a vibratory energy, a subtle vibratory energy to certain substances, which can then help to shift your vibrational energies in the right direction for healing modalities. And this, of course, is why there's sometimes seems like there are a lot of rules in Hinduism about the way food should be cooked and who's should be handling the food that you're eating and that sort of thing, that the vibrational energy of the people that have handled the food has some impact. Now, I think we can also overcome those with our own vibrational energies. We don't have to feel that we're subject to all of these lower vibrations. We can assert our own more spiritual vibrations, hopefully, on our surroundings and on our food. And that's part of the reason we also bless the food and offer the food in the shrine. It's actually been seen by some of our direct disciples and some of their disciples that the deities actually accept the offering in a spiritual way, that a light vibration comes from the deity and goes into the food offering during that particular part of the puja, so that the food really is brought to a higher vibrational state. All right. Of course, that leads to all sorts of interesting theories by people. I've heard some people wishfully thinking that prasad can't be fattening and things like that. I have a feeling that's probably just wishful thinking. But anyway, let's continue.
All these functions and sensations can be stopped by entering into superconsciousness. In short, one can cut off all connections with the body and mind and still continue to be conscious on the higher plane. It will be difficult for those who have not realized in samadhi to grasp this truth. Intellectual knowledge will not reveal the self. We must learn the method of going beyond intellect and rising above the realm of thoughts if we wish to realize the absolute self, or Atman. We shall be free from the bondage of ignorance. Intellectual apprehension, being relative and imperfect, cannot transcend the limits of phenomena and cannot reach the sphere of the absolute. Therefore it is said, he who thinks he knows the self knows it not. Self-knowledge precedes even the conception of God. If the thought about God which is in our mind be separated from self-consciousness, it instantly vanishes and becomes non-existent. We know God because there is knowledge in us, because the light of the self reveals the existence of God. This be so, we ask, which is higher, the personal God or the self? It must be said that the self is higher because it illumines the existence of God. This source of all knowledge, which is the absolute truth, is higher than a personal God. Since the personal God, who can be described by words and thought of the mind, becomes subject to mind and speech. Consequently, to the self or Atman, which is the director of mind and speech, and what is subject to a thing must be lower or less than what governs it. So when we try to know our true self, we do not attempt to know it as we know the existence of a book or a tree, because that kind of knowledge will never reveal it. We must not try to see any form, because there is no form in the self. We must not make the objects of the senses, like sound, color, odor, touch, the starting point of our search after self. For these are on the relative plane, while the self is the absolute being.
Yeah, so it's in this realm of Maya, the infinite, undivided, unchanging reality, the existence, consciousness, bliss has separated into the subject and the object and the process of knowing. It's all three. And so we tend to think it has to be one or the other, but it's actually all of those three processes that have manifested in this realm of Maya. And that's why we can't say that Maya is unreal or real. It's not, we're not seeing Brahman the way it really is, and yet it's nothing but Brahman. And so it has this conundrum of being, we can't say it's real and we can't say it's unreal. But it's this, it's a completely different kind of knowledge to have knowledge of the self than it is to have some kind of knowledge of something else. But ultimately, all knowledge that we gain in the ordinary sense is due to the fact that we are one with all existence, and we simply uncover things in our struggles to understand the external world. I think many people would say that the insights they've had, the discoveries they've had, or perhaps even us ordinary individuals studying a particular subject would have had experiences where you had to think deeply on something and just kind of be quiet and meditate and kind of let it sink in some way until the knowledge kind of became one with you. Really what you were doing was just uncovering the knowledge that was already there, but it feels like you're producing something, but in actuality you're simply uncovering something that's already there. Let's continue.
Thus we can understand the difference between the relative plane and the absolute one. So long as we are on the relative plane, we cannot reach the absolute, because the absolute, or absolute knowledge, by which we know the existence of things which are related to one another, is beyond all relations. All relative phenomena exist in and through the absolute. But the absolute Atman is independent and self-existent. If we were unintelligent beings and did not possess self-knowledge, then these sensations and perceptions would have no relation to us. The pure knowledge of the absolute self may be compared to the thread which goes through the pearls of percepts, ideas, and thoughts that rise in our minds and string them together into one harmonious whole, forming a garland of our daily experiences. This pure knowledge must not be confounded with the relative knowledge which is finite and related to ignorance or non-knowledge. The self, being the knower of ignorance, is higher and greater, and its light of absolute knowledge is that by which we realize that we know this or do not know that. In Vedanta it is said the self is the knower of that which sees, hears, thinks, or perceives. It is the knower of the body, senses, mind, intellect, and heart with which we identify ourselves. Through this identification, when the self appears as the ego, we say that we are the hearer, the seer, perceiver, and thinker. But the ego sees, hears, thinks, and perceives, being dependent upon the pure knowledge of the self. In fact, the ego cannot exist without self-knowledge. Self-knowledge and existence are one and the same. We know that we are here. If for a moment we forget that we are in this place, or if we become unconscious of our surroundings, we shall remain non-existent, as it were, in relation to our environments. Thus, although we may try to separate our self-knowledge from our existence, we can never do it, for pure knowledge or consciousness and existence are inseparable. When we have realized self-knowledge, we have understood our existence and discovered that the director of the mind is all knowledge and all existence. We say that the sun exists because we are conscious of it. When we are not conscious of the self as in trance, it does not exist in relation to us. Self-consciousness is therefore the standard of all relative knowledge and relative existence. Herein lies the beginning and the end of the existence of all objects which we can think of or perceive. The moment that we are unconscious of our body and everything of this world, they will cease to exist in relation to us. We all experience this truth during our sound sleep. When our conscious connection with the body being cut off, it ceases to exist, and consequently we do not claim anything of the material world as belonging to us. But as our consciousness returns to the body, instantly the body, together with everything related to it, appears as belonging to us. Therefore, it is said that knowledge and existence are one.
Now, of course, by self-consciousness, he's not talking about someone who feels self-conscious about themselves in the ordinary sense of the word. Often that phrase is used for someone who feels kind of shy or kind of exposed in some way and feels like, oh gosh, everybody's looking at me or something, and they feel self-conscious because they forgot to put their tie on straight or something, or they've got unmatched socks or whatever, so they're feeling self-conscious. That's not, of course, what he's talking about. Now, it's interesting that we sometimes can lose consciousness of the body to a certain extent, even in our ordinary state of mind, when the mind becomes so absorbed in something. So we might be totally absorbed in a book or in a movie or in a project, and we might have had some sort of physical ailment or pain in the body somewhere that when we didn't have anything to distract us was bothering us quite a bit. And then when we get totally wrapped up in something, we forget that we've got this pain in our hip or pain in our ankle or whatever it is. It just doesn't even occur to us. Our mind has been taken off of it. And of course we have examples. For example, Swami Abhedananda was able to, through his yogic powers, able to take his mind off his body to the extent where they could operate on his carbuncle on his back, and he didn't need any anesthesia to numb the pain. He could simply withdraw his consciousness from his body at will without having to be absorbed in some project or some favorite activity. So, and we've probably all had that experience to a limited extent, probably not to that extent that we want to have surgery, but that we've been able to overcome pain. We've certainly seen that in some of the athletes. You know, I remember not this Olympics, but a couple of Olympics ago, where one of the lady gymnasts had an injury to her ankle, and she had to compete in order for the team to win, and she just did it. She just collapsed afterwards, but she managed to transcend that pain and just go for it. So even us ordinary mortals are able to do some of these things occasionally. But of course, we're talking about something here which is where you're even not aware of the ordinary state of your mind in the superconscious state. All right, let's read another paragraph or two.
Vedanta gives these two attributes to the Absolute Self, who is the director of the mind. The first is absolute existence, in Sanskrit, sat, and the second is absolute knowledge, or intelligence, or consciousness, chit, in Sanskrit. These two, as we have already seen, are one and inseparable. The third attribute, however, is also given by Vedanta. It is called in Sanskrit Ananda, meaning pure happiness or blissfulness, where absolute knowledge and absolute existence prevail. There's also absolute happiness or blissfulness. It is different from changeable pleasure or relative happiness. Unchangeable blissfulness, again, is always attended with absolute peace. Wherever there is true happiness, there must be absolute peace. And the mind will not seek anything else, but will enjoy it and will try to possess it and never be separated from it. The ordinary pleasures which we mistake for true happiness may be agreeable for the time being, but in the next moment we dislike them and try to get away from them. Think how transitory are the pleasures that can be derived through the senses. They last only for a short time, and in the reaction makes us miserable. True happiness, however, is unchangeable. It brings no reaction and is everlasting. In the state of absolute existence and pure knowledge alone can be found absolute peace and true happiness. Such is the realm of our true self, which is above all our relativity and beyond all conditions of this earth. This indivisible Satchidananda, absolute existence, intelligence, bliss, the disciple realized in Samadhi as the director of the mind and the source of all the phenomena of the universe.
Yes, and as we've discussed before, when you, of course, you can't do it in time, but we talk about it this way. If you're going from oneness into multiplicity, into the state of Maya, you get time, space, and causation all at once. You don't get time first and then it comes space a little later. It has to all come at once. So similarly, when you're going the other direction, if you get to the state of superconsciousness, you get all three, Satchitananda, all at once. We think of them conceptually as three, but they are really one. They're indivisible. And it's simply three ways of describing that state. It's the closest thing we have to a description of the nature of Brahman. We can say it's infinite, undivided, and unchanging, or we can say it's Satchitananda, existence, consciousness, bliss. Those are the closest descriptions we have, and they're in threes, but the threes are really one. It's not like you have three jobs to do. You don't have to realize your existence and then realize your consciousness and then you'll realize your bliss. It comes all at once. So why don't I take a turn reading here? I haven't read for a while. He then said, whoever realizes that which manifests within us as the conscious self attains to immortality. Death means a change of the body. The body may die, the mind may die, the senses may die, but pure knowledge can never die. When we know that something is dying, and if we do not identify ourselves with it, but become conscious of our absolute self, then we are sure to attain to immortality. If we once grasp the idea that we are the absolute being, how can we ever be changed by death into a non-being? As being cannot come out of non-being, so it cannot go back to non-being. Pure existence can never become non-existence. This is the proof of immortality. The absolute self, or Atman, is the immortal being. It is also Brahman, the beginning and the end of the universe. The same eternal being is worshipped as God. Under various names and forms, he is the being who dwells in us and is inseparable from our true self. The absolute being is not many, but one. If there were many absolute beings, they would be limited by each other and consequently not absolute. The one absolute being alone is immortal and deathless, and by knowing it, we become immortal. No divine incarnation can give us immortality if we do not possess it already. The Christian belief that immortality can be obtained only through the grace of Jesus the Christ is not founded upon the knowledge of the immortal nature of our true self. The students of Vedanta are not deluded by such statements. They try first to know the real self, and then they realize that immortality, which is their birthright. You know, it's interesting. Years ago when we started this Friday night class, there was one lady that came to every single class. She came to all the classes. She was so regular. And one time she came and her brother had come to stay with her because he was dying and he was very sick and in bed and so forth. And she was, very disturbed that he was not doing well. And she was even more disturbed when he had made a statement that he wasn't going to die. Well, she knew perfectly well he was going to die. The body was not in good shape, and it was inevitable. But it disturbed her that he would think that. But I pointed out to her that perhaps being that close to death, he was beginning to realize that he wasn't that body and that he really wasn't going to die. He may be leaving his body, but the real him wasn't going to die. Now, of course, in this idea about Christianity, Christianity is a path. It's a path to a goal. And you can take that attitude that Christ is your Savior and that you have these sins. We wouldn't call it that, of course. In Vedanta, we would say it would be ignorance. But it doesn't really matter what you call it. If you devote yourself to a divine incarnation, you can free yourself from that ignorance or from those sins. And so the result is the same. Paths can be perfectly valid religious paths without the theology necessarily being the clearest of the theologies. And so while that his point is well taken, that this the idea that somehow you have to get your immortality from someplace else doesn't really make sense. But as a spiritual path, the result is the same because you realize that your immortality. You didn't realize it before. And if you're thinking that you're going to die, like Dorothy thinks she's a piece of meat in The Wizard of Oz, then that's your state of mind, and you need to find that immortality. And you can do that by worshiping an incarnation like Jesus. All right, you want to take a turn? Well, I thought we were going to finish this tonight, but we're just barely going to finish this. I'm not sure we're going to get to the next one.
Since the true self is the source of all strength, the disciple said, we gain strength and immortality by self-knowledge. Real strength comes to us when we have known that which is changeless and immortal. The spiritual strength which is gained through self-knowledge is greater than material, physical, mental, and moral strength together. All other powers except spiritual strength are subject to change and death. Few people understand the meaning of spiritual strength. The word spirit is not meant a disembodied spirit, but the absolute spirit or self or Atman or Brahman. Spirit is that self which is the source of absolute intelligence and which is the absolute being. Knowing it one attains to spiritual strength, which is higher than physical or psychic strength. With physical strength, a man can kill a tiger or destroy thousands of mortals, but it will not protect him from death. He may possess material strength, but it will not save his life at the last moment. He may gain psychic power and do wonderful things, but this will not stop the changes of body and mind. Spiritual strength, however, which self-knowledge brings, makes one free from birth and death. He who has gained physical and psychic powers will remain subject to birth and death. But if he can know that immortal being, he becomes master of the universe. The gigantic forces of nature serve and obey the command of him who has acquired self-knowledge. If a man knows the self here, he has gained the truth. In this world of imperfection, he who has known the self has realized the absolute truth and has fulfilled the highest purpose of life. He has attained absolute freedom, perfect peace, and true happiness in this life. But if he does not know this here, for him there is great suffering. He who does not realize the self comes back to this earth again and again, and remaining in ignorance seeks sense pleasures and suffers great sorrow and misery. He does not escape the law of karma and reincarnation. The wise ones who have realized the all-pervading absolute self, Brahman, in all animate and inanimate objects, become immortal after departing from this world. The knower of the absolute and immortal self becomes one with it and remains as the immortal and perfect spirit forever and ever.
Yeah, there was one other thing I meant to mention. You talked about how pleasures are rather fleeting, and oftentimes after they're over, then there's even kind of a sense of sadness or a lack because the pleasure is over. And I think the ultimate case of that is when people get addicted to something. They get addicted to some substance which gives them some sort of pleasure, and because when it wears off they feel kind of down, then they want more, so then they have to take it again. And as they keep doing this, the pleasure tends to wear off even faster, and you tend to need more and more, and so you take more and more, and so pretty soon the negative side effects of whatever it is, the drug that you're taking, ends up being overpowering anything that was positive to begin with, if there was anything positive, at least your perception of it being positive. And so, so there you are. You found that, but you see how tricky the senses are. The senses can't seem to distinguish sometimes that a substance is only fooling you into thinking it's doing something for you, or it's such a temporary pleasure that it's like a sugar. Even sugar, you see, is can be that for some people. If it raises your blood sugar so much that you get kind of a rush of energy, but then the insulin pumps in even faster and drives your blood sugar down even lower, so you need more sugar, and so then you eat more sugar, and you raise another spike, and then it goes back down again. So even something as simple as sugar can have this kind of effect. And of course, caffeine, caffeine and tobacco and all these ordinary things that we tend to indulge in, alcohol. So all of these things, even though, some people say that there are certain benefits to drinking wine and that kind of thing. So that's very possible if you don't eat too much. And of course, sugar is a natural part of our diet. It's in all sorts of fruits and vegetables. And when you digest carbohydrates, you get sugars, but it's the way we take it in excess that tends to knock our system off. And sometimes people have individual systems that just don't tolerate things. There are certain, I think, genetic traits which lead some people to be more addictive to certain substances like alcohol. There are certain genetic propensities that some people have that lead them open to being addicted, where other people, they can take a drink and that's it, and they don't care. One's fine. There's no urge to take another one. There's no problem afterwards. And so it differs from one person to another, with one substance to another. But oftentimes we use that to make excuses for ourselves when we ourselves might have a big problem. And so just because we see one person not having a problem, you have to be extremely aware of what your problem is and not base it on someone else's experience. Well, we only have a couple minutes. I don't think it's worth starting the next lecture. It will be the immortality of the self. But I will remind you again that we'll be having Shivaratri on Tuesday night going into Wednesday morning. And we will also be celebrating Ramakrishna's puja next week from this Sunday, although his actual puja day, I think, is actually going to be Friday, the Friday of this class. I think it's the 4th. So we can perhaps say a few extra words about that, but we won't be doing our formal worship that day. We'll be postponing it a couple days so that more people can enjoy it when they're free. All right, so let's close with a chant. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Om, peace, peace, peace.